Folklore is an easy way to get interested in your local history. The stories are often more colorful and intriguing than what you might find in the history books. While it may not always be easy to differentiate fact from fiction, many times there are grains of truth from which the story grew. One of these stories is that of the Baldoon Mystery. In 1829, not far outside of present-day Wallaceburg, Ontario, one of Canada's most notable stories of the supernatural took place. The tale revolves around the MacDonald family, and many years after the fact, Neil MacDonald wrote the book The Baldoon Mystery, which details the events and includes a section of witness testimonials. I think one of the reasons this story has captivated so many people over the years are its real-world connections to people and places that did and do exist. But before we get too far on that thought, we'll give a retelling of the story as we visit its locations, and then we'll jump back into a deep dive on the history and facts.
This is the Baldoon Mystery. Along the banks of the Chanel Écarté, Lord Selkirk envisioned another colony for the struggling farming families from his homeland of Scotland. He had the land surveyed and purchased over 4,000 acres to set up his vision, which would be known as Baldoon. 15 families made their way from the Isle of Mull to forge a new life in Baldoon. Along their pilgrimage, the settlers and their livestock encountered wolves, black bears, rattlesnakes, and disease. When they finally arrived at Baldoon, they found that the men hired to build shelters had fled in fear of the local wildlife and nearby natives. By the end of the first year, roughly 40% of the settlers had died. Over the next decade, the new settlers faced numerous hardships: failed crops, harsh winters, malaria, and raids during the War of 1812. Eventually, the settlers started to move away from the dwindling community, and ultimately Lord Selkirk sold his remaining land. One of the original families remaining on this hapless land was the MacDonalds. In the years since the failed Baldoon settlement, increased population and better infrastructure had made carving out a life in the area a little easier, and the MacDonald family began to prosper. When their eldest son John came of age, he married and built a small home nearby, close to the Chanel Écarté. It wasn't long before the new couple began a family. Not far from John's new home lived the people of the long, low log house, an unsociable and unfriendly family who coveted the MacDonald's land. Over time, the old woman and her children from the long, low log house approached John with offers to purchase the property, but all were refused as the MacDonald's life was good. But this would soon change. The first anomaly to disrupt the MacDonald family happened on a warm, late summer afternoon. The MacDonald women were in their barn, weaving yellow straw hats for the men, when all of a sudden, a giant pole from the barn's roof dislodged itself and came crashing down between them. Alarmed but unharmed, the girls continued with their task. Some time passed before a second pole fell from the rafters. Now on edge, they searched for any clues as to what had caused the displaced poles, but found none. After a while, they once more returned to their weaving. But just as their spirits had calmed, a third pole thundered down between them. They ran back to the house and tried to focus on their other chores. But not long into their new activities, the women were interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Following the noise, they came to find a fresh, round hole in their window and a bullet laying in the middle of the floor. Before they had time to contemplate its origins, another bullet came sailing through the window, and then another, and then another. Rightfully frightened, the young women fled to a neighbor's house. Oddly enough, after piercing the window pane, the bullets never made it far, instead dropping onto the floor in the middle of the room. The barrage of bullets became a regular occurrence, and after shattering every window in the residence, wooden planks were placed to cover the holes. But the bullets continued, now without leaving holes. They seemingly appeared inside the house, and they were soon accompanied by small rocks and stones. As the mysterious projectiles persisted, they were joined by ghostly footsteps, trampling and knocking. Walking around the house, the McDonalds would hear steps behind them, but would turn to find nothing. At night, they were haunted by marching and stomping throughout the house. After mustering up the courage, they would open their bedroom doors to again find nothing. As the disturbances increased, so too did the scores of curious neighbors and inquisitive travelers. People came from far and wide to witness the strange occurrences. Accounts tell of dishes, kettles, tables, and chairs rising in the air and being tossed about the room. One such object was a 10-inch knife which flew across the room and lodged itself into the window frame. On one occasion, the lead weights belonging to John MacDonald's fishing net were suddenly tossed at their feet within the house. After examining the net, it was noted that no damage had been caused in the mysterious removal of the weights. The objects that mystifyingly appeared in the house would be tossed by family members and visitors alike into the Canal Écarté, only to reappear at their feet moments later, still wet from the river. Those that came as skeptics left as believers. Until now, the only real damage that had been caused was to the family's nerves, but things soon began to escalate. A weary traveler stopped by the residence one night looking for a place to sleep. Undaunted by the McDonald's warnings, the man stepped into the troubled home. Moments later, the rifle he was carrying exploded, followed by the McDonald's gun which had been resting against the wall in the corner of the room. Soon, the fires began. First, it was small balls of embers that they noticed in the air. Then little bundles of cobwebs, flax, or clothing were found aflame throughout the house. The family needed to be constantly on alert in order to keep the fires from spreading. Lit logs would be thrown from the hearth. Smoke would seep through the walls and floorboards, and small bonfires would be found in closed closets. Try as they might, the McDonalds simply couldn't keep up with the unending fires, and eventually the house burst into flames and burned to the ground. It happened in an instant, and the family were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The McDonalds were taken in by family and sympathetic neighbors, bouncing from home to home. Each time they were followed by the strange occurrences, and each time they began to escalate, such as they did in their original dwelling. It was always necessary to move on before the mischievous fires began to endanger their hosts' homes. With nowhere else to go, the afflicted family moved into John's childhood home with his father. For a while, things in the residence were calm. During this time, the family started to see a black dog around the property. It would appear one minute and be gone the next. It was seen in impossible places, such as the rooftop of the home, and no one was ever able to catch it. In a few short weeks, the happenings came to their new home. The rocks and bullets came through the windows, furniture was thrown about, and the footsteps and marching were back. This time a new form of sinister incident was plaguing the family, or, more accurately, their livestock. Oxen, hogs, horses, and hens all began getting sick and dying, causing great distress and hardship among the McDonalds. As the news of the family's troubles spread, authorities began to take an interest in the case. First, a British Army captain named Lewis Bennett visited the home to observe the disturbances. He witnessed all the usual disruptions, such as moving furniture, stones, and flying bullets. Even the bullets from his own shot belt would disappear from his person and reappear moments later, cast around the room. He found a burning hot stone in the baby's crib after responding to its cries, and had his gun explode without warning. He was left baffled and with no better understanding of the case. Authorities from Toronto came to put an end to the foolishness. They didn't want the event's proliferating superstitions throughout the population. The MacDonalds were quickly moved to a makeshift camp a short distance away by the Running Creek River. The disturbances not only didn't stop in the home, but also followed the MacDonalds to their temporary quarters. Like the others who came before them, the lawmen were unable to find any logical or reasonable explanation for the turmoil and returned to the city with their tail between their legs. It wasn't just the curious and the government that had been attracted to the MacDonalds' now famous situation, but also the con artists, charlatans, and holy men. A native medicine man came with many promises, but ultimately failed to return on the day he was supposed to perform his ritual that would free the family. Church leaders from various denominations came, but their words and actions were fruitless. A school teacher by the name of Robert Barker came to the residents to attempt exorcising the spirits causing them so much distress. He urgently nailed a horseshoe over the door of the home and would write letters commanding any spirits to leave. It seems Mr. Barker never got the attention of the spirits, but did get the attention of the authorities. He received word that local lawmen were on their way to arrest him for witchcraft and promptly fled. It was a visit from Reverend McDormand that would lead John to his family's salvation. The Reverend told John of a child in the care of a Dr. Troyer. This child supposedly had second sight and could read a mystical moonstone. At this point, John MacDonald was willing to try anything that might relieve his family of their troubles. Arrangements were made, and soon the two had set out on their journey, crossing through vast marshes and seemingly impenetrable forests. On the quest's second night, the men passed through the Longwoods forest, riding by moonlight. It was here the men found themselves surrounded by the sounds of thundering horses, crashing boughs, and snapping twigs. They could see no mysterious riders in the night, but the sounds continued. The Reverend began to sing a hymn as they rode. Around them came the sounds of clashing enemies, screams of wounded and dying could be heard, but the two remained the only visible riders in the night. As they rode, the sounds eventually faded, and by the morning light, the men could finally rest. Another day on the trail passed, and John and Reverend McDormand eventually reached the doctor's dwelling. They were welcomed inside by Dr. Troyer and went about explaining the MacDonald situation to him. Troyer introduced John to the young girl who purportedly possessed the power of second sight. MacDonald retold his family's story to the girl. She then asked him if he'd ever had trouble regarding a piece of land. John could not think of any trouble. The girl asked, "Did you not refuse to sell a portion of your land to neighbors who desired it?" John thought back, remembering the offers from the people of the long, low log house, which he told the girl. "I see," she replied, and was then able to give an accurate description of the neighbors. She then retired to a private room to consult the moonstone. Hours later, she returned to the men, telling them she had seen fire in the stone and believed another of the MacDonald's barns had been burnt that night. She then asked John, "Have you ever seen a stray goose in your flock?" He told her he had, and he had even shot at it once, but it had escaped. "Of that you may be certain," she replied. "No bullet of lead would ever harm a feather of that bird. That bird is the destroyer of your peace. Taking the shape of that bird is your enemy. You shall mold a bullet of sterling silver, and you shall fire at the bird. If you wound it, your enemy will be wounded in some corresponding part of the body. Go and be at peace." Once home, John asked his children if they had seen any strange geese in the flock. They told him of a black-headed goose with long, dark feathers in each wing. The next day, John was up with the sun to visit a neighbor and craft his silver bullet. By breakfast, he had gathered a small group to follow him along the river in search of the black-headed goose. It wasn't long before they came across a flock floating on the water. In the midst of these geese, John saw his target. He paused to gather his wits and slowly raised his rifle. The gun roared and was soon followed by the strange, almost human cry of the bird. It hastily made its way to the tall reeds with an obviously broken wing. John turned his footsteps towards the marsh and the long, low log house. When he arrived, he saw the old woman sitting on a chair, resting a broken arm and looking frail. When her eyes met with John's, she sank down into the chair. He knew his mission was successful. The strange and dangerous happenings that plagued the MacDonald family ceased immediately. The MacDonalds soon began to rebuild their lives, now free from the torment caused by the witch of the long, low log house.
So that's the story, mind you, in a bit of an abridged form. If you're interested in reading the full version, we'll link to it below. Before we get into the facts and history of this story, there are a couple other supernatural explanations for what happened at Baldoon that have been proposed over the years. This helps show how the superstitions from different cultures and time periods can affect what people perceive happened. The Baldoon settlement sat directly across a river from Walpole Island First Nation. At the time of the events, Reverend Peter Jones, an Ojibwe missionary, spoke with the chief of Walpole Island about the occurrences. This is what he had to say. So he believed it to be the work of offended and displaced fairies.
But these aren't the doll-sized butterfly wing fairies you may be imagining.
No, the hidden beings were believed to be 2 to 3 foot tall creatures that possessed magical abilities, like being able to turn invisible. More recently, it's been suggested the disturbances were caused by a poltergeist. A couple of books mention it possibly being a young woman, one of the MacDonald's daughters, attracting the poltergeist. But even if you could prove something like that, it doesn't seem to match up with any of the ages of the women in the MacDonald family. So, we've seen the story update itself over the years, altering its possible cause to the popular beliefs and superstitions of the time, from witches and fairies to poltergeists and disturbed children. Over the years, more plausible explanations have been proposed, which we'll discuss at the end of this episode. Now, we'll look at all the places, people, and accounts of this story that do exist and have kept people intrigued for so long. Starting off with the setting, the Baldoon settlement. The beginning of our retelling about the settlement is all true. Lord Selkirk, also known as Thomas Douglas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, was a Scottish philanthropist, and over his lifetime, he was responsible for immigrating hundreds of Scottish families to new settlements in Pkwy, Manitoba, and Ontario here at Baldoon. The formal version of Baldoon ultimately ended in failure for a number of reasons, but most of all, its location. It was on quite marshy land, which was home to many malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the winters there were brutal. Both of these factors alone killed many of its original population. Due to its proximity to the U.S. border, their livestock and provisions were stolen during raids by the states in the War of 1812. And finally, the settlement was just grossly mismanaged by the people Lord Selkirk had left in charge. Some of those original settlers did stick it out, and one of those families was the McDonalds. The family was very much real, and they are recorded in the ship's logs that brought them to Canada, as well as land deeds and later on in census data. In this family were Donald, his wife Flora, and their children, one of which was their son John, who is the protagonist of this story. In 1822 and 1824, John MacDonald and his father Donald purchased these plots of land. John, the north and south halves of Lot A, Concession 4, and Donald, the south half of Lot B, Concession 4. This is the area they would have been living during the time of the story. John's original house that the disturbances originated at and that eventually burnt down would have been somewhere in this area. And Donald's home, which John and his family moved to after the loss of theirs, would have been in this area. There was also a McDonald graveyard on this property at one point, but in the 1980s, I think we read, the farmer who owned the land plowed over the gravestones, which were already in pretty bad shape. Here's a shot of some of those broken up stones, again from the 1980s. Also, just to note, I don't think any of these belong to anyone from in the story. No buildings or anything like that from this location of the story remain. In McDonald Park, which is just southwest of the land, you'll find a plaque commemorating the Baldoon settlement. You'll also find one remembering the Baldoon Mystery. I think over time a lot of people got the idea that one of the homes from the mystery was located here. But from my understanding, it's more of a convenience thing. A park is a great place for people to be able to see the plaques.
And it does say near this site, not right here.
If you've ever read about the Baldoon Mystery before, you've probably seen pictures of this house labeled as the Baldoon Mystery House. Historians familiar with the subject agree that this home probably had nothing to do with the story. Of course, the original house of John MacDonald would most likely have been further inland and on the lots he owned, but it also supposedly burned down in the story. And while Donald's home, where they moved, could have been up close to the river like this, it's believed to have been long gone by the time these pictures were created, which was probably almost 100 years later. So why did this house get mistaken for the MacDonald's residence? In short, money. In the early 1900s, steamship cruises were popular on the Great Lakes, and their owners were always looking for destinations that would draw new passengers. One of these companies decided the Baldoon Mystery would intrigue people. They'd travel up the river on this boat, the Thousand Islander, while telling the story. But they needed something for the people to actually see, to advertise with, and to sell postcards of. So they picked a house right along the river and in the general area the story took place, and that would be their haunted house. If you repeat something enough, over time it eventually legitimizes it, and the house just kind of became the Baldoon Mystery House. It eventually burnt down in the year 1930. There are a few notable people mentioned in this story. Notable because we can both confirm they were real people that existed, but also because we confirm they were there and that parts of their story at least have some truth to them. One was the teacher, Robert Barker, who came to attempt to exorcise the spirits from the house. This did happen, and he was actually arrested for witchcraft, for pretending to practice witchcraft, which was until quite recently
2017
against the law in Canada.
And Upper Canada at that time.
It was essentially a fraud charge. Robert Barker hadn't charged the MacDonalds for the act of exorcising the spirits, but he did charge to write the letters he was using in the exorcism. Charging for writing services was common at the time since lots of people weren't fully literate. Robert was taken to jail in Sandwich, Ontario, which is present-day Windsor. He stood trial, was convicted, and was sentenced to 1 year in jail and to stand in pillory at the end of each quarter. Now, Robert obviously wasn't too happy with this, and he wrote John Colborne, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, with a petition for clemency. Thankfully for him, John Colborne was persuaded by his letter and granted Mr. Barker relief from his sentence. Another character is Reverend Peter Jones. He was the Ojibwe missionary who spoke with the Walpole Island chief in the story. He published a book in 1861 which details him visiting the McDonald's house during the time of the disturbances. He didn't see anything unusual on his visit, but he was told by a fellow Reverend R. Phelps, about their visit, which was full of strange events. He also talked with the Walpole Island chief, which we already mentioned, so he didn't see anything himself, but talked with someone who had and another who was familiar with the case. But what's most intriguing about Reverend Jones' section on the story is that he offers up a different ending to what appears in Neil MacDonald's version. In Jones's version, Dr. John Troyer, the witch doctor, is called for. They don't travel to him and the young girl. Reverend Jones says that when leaving Baldoon, he met Dr. Troyer along the way. Troyer said he believed it to be the work of witches and he knew what to do. Jones said he later heard that Troyer had loaded guns with silver bullets and had fired them all over the place, eventually fleeing because authorities were informed about his recklessly shooting off guns and they were coming to get him. Apparently after this, the occurrences surrounding the MacDonalds just stopped. No mention of a young girl with powers or of any black-headed goose. Before we move to our next person, we'll move to a couple of locations from the story. After John MacDonald is told by Reverend McDormand about Dr. John Troyer and the young girl with powers, they set off towards Troyer's residence. In the story, Neil MacDonald writes about them traveling through Longwoods forest and one night being surrounded by the sounds of warfare. Although Neil doesn't outright say it in the book, this is where the Battle of Longwoods took place during the War of 1812. He's adding in even more supernatural elements to the story with this supposed encounter with ghostly soldiers, but the location and the battle are real. From there, MacDonald and McDormand arrive at Troyer Flats and meet the very real and very interesting John Troyer, the witch doctor. John Troyer was born in Pennsylvania, but immigrated here to Norfolk County in the late 1700s. He built his home here on what's now known as Troyer Flats, and while the structure may not have survived to present day, the Norfolk County Archives have the original door and a piece of the wooden blockhouse in their collection. Despite being called Dr. Troyer or the Witch Doctor, Troyer had no formal medical training. He was more of what you might think of as a medicine man. He made herbal remedies and performed bloodletting. There are lots of stories about John Troyer, but we'll focus on stuff related to witchcraft and Baldoon. Troyer was a deeply superstitious man, and he was particularly afraid or cautious about witches. He would set up a bear trap by his bed at night to protect himself against being kidnapped by witches. A thing that he said happened sometimes. One story he told was that one night he was turned into a horse by witches. They rode him across Lake Erie where they tied him up and made him watch their rituals. So the guy was known for his run-ins with witches. Relating back to the Baldoon Mystery, we know that he went to try and help the MacDonalds by Reverend Jones' account of seeing him and talking to him on the road there. Also, in one of the witness statements at the back of Neil's book, it says that Troyer went to the MacDonalds, not the other way around. But what about the girl who could see in the moonstone, you might ask? Well, Neil's book is the only version of the story that takes place. Troyer did have a daughter, but by the time the Baldoon Mystery was taking place, she was a middle-aged woman and not still at home. A local historian, Harry B. Barrett, suggested it could have been a young girl from the Fick family. There certainly were Ficks around, but we couldn't find a copy of his book, so we don't know how he came to that conclusion. The last point to mention about the Troyer name is that earlier in Neil's book, he mentions a Reverend Troyer. In the book, he's Catholic. In real life, John Troyer had a son who was a prominent Baptist deacon. Our guess is, if this part has any truth to it, is that it was most likely him. Neil seems to get lots of little details wrong throughout the book. We've looked at a few of the people and places in this story that we can say were real. But what about the actual events? We know something was going on at the McDonald's from both Reverend Jones' second-hand account of the occurrences and first-hand account with Troyer, as well as the teacher Robert Barker's documented arrest and the letter of clemency from the time. There was also an article written in the Detroit Gazette while the events were supposed to be taking place. It's from November 19th, 1829, and here's what it said. So this was from near the beginning, but after John MacDonald's house had burnt down. At the end of Neil's book, there's an appendix which has a collection of witness statements. They all touch on different parts of the story and most mention the flying stones, bullets, and household items. L.A. McDougall's testimonial is one of the longer ones in the book, and it corroborates a lot of the events in Neil's book, but it stops short of mentioning anything about going to see Dr. Troyer, the girl with powers, or anything about a goose. His testimony was notable because in 1894, the Globe newspaper in Toronto tracked him down and interviewed him about it. He was 84 years old at the time. When asked about what went on at Baldoon, he gave an account pretty similar to what he said in the book. He witnessed stones and bullets bombarding the house, the fires, and staying over one night and having the bed he was sleeping in sway like he was on a boat at sea. But McDougall also says in the article that the book was mostly lies. So we've seen a few accounts from at or around the time. The documents from the teacher, Robert Barker's arrest, Reverend Jones' recollection of the events in his book, the Detroit Gazette article, and the Globe article that interviews McDougall, none of which say anything about traveling to go see a clairvoyant girl or a black-headed goose. With nothing backing up that part of the story, and with McDougall's comment on the book being mostly lies, it's probably safe to say that the ending was most likely invented by Neil MacDonald in his book to give a more exciting ending to what may have been a much more anticlimactic reality.
But something happened.
Yeah, it just probably wasn't supernatural. Over the years, there's been a lot of speculation on what events really happened and what the real causes were. Local historians, Frank and Alan Mann, have written extensively on both the area and the Baldoon Mystery, the latter having updated the Baldoon Mystery book with a section at the end featuring historical information and articles. One of the explanations they wrote deals with the neighbor wanting some of the McDonald's land, so, similar to Neil's book. In this account, there's an Anishinaabe burial ground between their properties. The neighbor that wants McDonald's land desecrates the burial plot. They blame John MacDonald and encourage a group of native people to harass the McDonalds day and night, guiding them with suggestions on how to torment the family. The end goal, I guess, being to drive them away from the land. There's no good ending given to this theory either. Again, it just kinda stops. Maybe because after years of this, the McDonalds haven't given up, so it's called off, or maybe the enthusiasm behind it just fades. Folklore has a lasting power. We want to believe the tales even when we can't prove them. So while we may not be able to know what truly happened to the MacDonald family, whether it was witchcraft, fairies, or more probably a jealous neighbor or hoax, the story that caught the attention of people at the time continues to do so almost 200 years later.